Sweet evening.
I'm writing it down.
Hello everyone and welcome to It's Nothing If It's Not Funny! I'm Kinsey, and I'll be your host this evening. We're going to be on a wild ride, as you can see, through all the types of comedy that nobody wants to watch except for this modern generation. But before we begin, let's go through our lovely panelists. From somewhere between the baby boomers and Gen X, we have Dr. Michael Basket. From Generation Y, although she doesn't identify as a millennial, we have Danielle Green. From that gray area between Gen Y and Gen Z, we have Nathan Shapiro. And solidly Gen Z, Stella Garibaldi. Now, if I may ask from our panel here, if you could say one sentence to react to what you just saw, what would that be? Go ahead.
What the?
Come back to me.
I find the Shrek video to be beautifully haunting.
I would bounce off of that and say that it was the epitome of modern art.
All right.
Well, I would say that I don't entirely know what just happened. So that is my sentence.
Wonderful. You see, as we were watching that, we got very different reactions from the audience and from our panel here, and that's what we're here to talk about today. In over time, content changes and comedy changes severely. In this modern age of fast-moving technology and communication, content changes its forms extremely fast, and it gets to places that have never before been seen. And this is happening at a rate faster than it ever has been before. And so we have new types of media, new types of comedy. One type of comedy is this: nihilist comedy. Now there's two types of nihilistic comedy, and that is nihilistic in content and nihilistic in form. Now, nihilist may seem a bit of a strong term to begin with. These are just jokes, but the subjects of these jokes and the content that builds these jokes is very different and brought about by this progression in time. First, we're going to discuss the nihilistic in content, which is much easier to explain. Nihilistic in content is mostly just the pieces themselves. They discuss nihilistic ideas and such as the world is pointless, death is but an illusion, reality is meaningless, and we all should do without it. Light stuff that's enjoyable for all. But nihilistic in content only addresses these issues, and while it has been accepted in this, it has existed for almost all of comedy. It's been around for a long time. Now it has come to a prominence that it almost has never seen before. Next slide, because we have an example of nihilistic in content.
Hello, honey. Where do we go when we die? Oh, well, we go somewhere very, very nice. And and very far away where everyone we love is.
Mom,
Yes?
why do I miss people who hurt me?
That's because you're a dummy. Okay? Dumb little, stupid little dum-dum.
Yeah. You see, in that piece, the traditional comedy forms and storytelling modes were in effect. The piece followed the right beats. It hit the message. It hit the joke, the subversion of expectations there, as it normally would. But it had a strong nihilist content, which is popular today. Now, more complex, we have nihilistic in form. These are not jokes per se. This is a style of approaching a joke, or a style of approaching a video in itself. Nihilistic in form is very similar to the actual nihilist philosophy of political nihilism. In that philosophy, establishment needs to be taken down. It needs to be destroyed because there are flaws, there are things that are wrong with it. But there's no plan for afterward. After the deconstruction of the nihilist, or deconstruction of the established ways, there is no plan, there is no meaning, there is no step forward. This is very similar to nihilistic in form when it comes to comedy. For the established trends in humor and the established ideas that are brought about are taken apart, but there's no real reason for doing so. They do it for a joke. We're going to see an example here in this next slide.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
I like the very response we got. Yeah, thank you. Now, as we can see in that piece, what was the joke? It's very intentionally bad. It's definitely taking some meaning behind it. The title of that video was called Rebirth. There's no explanation for that. The video itself doesn't necessarily seem to have a meaning, which might be hidden, given, but the meaning does not add to it. The meaning does not necessarily apply to it. The principles of comedy and the principles of filmmaking that built that piece were ridiculed and destroyed in that piece. And there was nothing after except laughter. It did not advance it. It did not pull it back. It may have pulled it back, I guess. But the goal essentially was to break it down in order to be funny, which is nihilistic in form. Moving on past we have the abstract versus the nihilist. We can see in that film example very explicitly that nihilist comedy can be extremely similar to abstract comedy. However, there is a big difference, a very significant difference that may not seem apparent when you first watch it. Abstract comedy, abstract pieces do not necessarily have, or abstract pieces do have a meaning or an intent behind them. We have an example of modern abstract, essentially humor here.
Come on guys, let's get creative! Get creative! creative again. Get creative.
It's okay. As we can see in this example, putting aside all the very dark imagery and details in this, there is definitely an intent behind the strangeness in this, an intent behind all the actions, all the choices that were made. Sure, a lot of it was broken. A lot of the conventions that are normally shown in this, kids' TV shows, even horror, and actually filming the show itself, blending together different medias, all of that established, broken, but there's still a meaning behind it. There's still a point that they were trying to get across, either by their medium themselves or the message they were conveying. And at this point, it's been a while since we've talked to all of you. I'd like to ask our panel here the responses between the two. Do you think it's significant between nihilist and abstract, or do you think there was meaning in all content, or perhaps there's no meaning in any content? Does anybody have anything they want to bring up? I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I would say that there is meaning, partly because there is someone creating the content. And we can read meaning into it. Whether or not, we read it the same way as the person who created it, I think there is still meaning that can be found in it, and even in the fact that we laugh, or somebody laughs at it.
I agree with you saying because somebody created it, there's meaning to it. And I think the abstract humor, as opposed to nihilist humor, is disproportionately driven by that meaning, while the nihilist humor is more driven by just the timing, and depending on whether it's form or content, it's sometimes driven purely by timing, whereas abstract is driven purely by its meaning and whether or not it's creating that message, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think for me, when it comes to something like Rebirth, where there could very well be a deeper meaning and metaphor, or whatever it is that the creator is trying to get out there, but my enjoyment of it, searching for meaning, does not factor into why I might find that funny, whereas with the abstract video, I think that does factor in a bit more so with the theme of creativity that it's bringing up. It wasn't a part of my enjoyment in the previous one.
When I hear all this talk about differences between form and content, one of the big debates I remember we used to have in just among people making movies, but also in grad school and everything, was this idea that really what's the difference? And so when I hear about nihilist comedy having less to do with meaning and more about simply just some sort of a response, I kind of reach for my Luger. I kind of wonder, I wonder if that's true or not. Because it's so based on form. You look at, for example, the humor is parodying recognizable forms. So the form itself means that in order for it to be humorous, even if, as long as somebody's laughing, the recognition then itself is meaning. And it has to be based on sort of this idea of sort of an accepted response to it, and you're breaking that. And it's that deviation that becomes pleasurable for, even if it's not me laughing, for somebody else.
And I wonder if what you point out, you're saying that with the abstract one, you are sort of searching for meaning, and I wonder if that's prompted by maybe a prior knowledge that there is something to find here, as opposed to the other where you're prompted to laugh and simply enjoy.
I think, bouncing off of that, I think if you were to try to search for the meaning in nihilist humor, it would, whereas with abstract humor, it might deepen your understanding of the piece. In nihilist humor, it might kind of ruin it for you. if you try to search for the meaning in it, which is probably the intent behind it, giving it meaning within itself. But yeah, I think abstract, you're able to, allowed and encouraged to search for the meaning, whereas nihilist, that might kind of lead it to fall apart for you.
Isn't that kind of the point of humor, though?
Yeah?
The idea that, once you've explained it, you've killed it. You've
Oh,
ruined
yes,
it.
absolutely.
And so, even just this process of our trying to, dissect this itself is, kind of, we're all part of the problem rather than the solution.
I mean, we're not being very funny right now. No.
But, funny is a kind of a loaded thing, right?
It is.
It doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily funny. It's like common sense, right?
Mhm. There was, I'm taking a Chicago pop culture class right now, and we had to watch something, it was a neo-futurist performance that was a comedy trying to explain why things are funny, and it was the worst piece of comedy I've ever seen in my life, because they were trying to explain comedy while also being comedic, and it completely ruined it for them, and my entire class hated it. I don't think we were supposed to, but we did.
So kind of the point we ended on, if not the point that we entirely supposed were trying to make, was that comedy in itself is a little bit nihilist. If looking for the meaning of a joke disrupts the very purpose of the joke, then isn't the joke by its very nature something that should exist without as much meaning? We can use that to segue into our next bit, which is what we just kind of exhibited in this part, the general differences in perspective on this topic. As we can see, we have who we're going to collectively call, as Gen Z and Gen Y, the buzz feeders. And yeah, they may not like it, but it's appropriate. And then non-affinity or non-relying millennial and Gen X to baby boomers, we're going to consider the New Yorkers.
We like that even less.
That one's worse.
Yeah. Regardless, they're non-offensive titles. As we can see, there is a bit of a divide between the two. The BuzzFeeders more have moved toward enjoying things without the meaning associated with them, and the New Yorkers move toward finding that meaning and explaining things with that meaning and adding that onto the enjoyment. In light of that, we're going to continue our discussion with our next slide, an example to discuss. We're going to get into this even further than we just did. We're going to discuss nihilist humor based on the next example. Is the next example nihilist humor? Is the next example funny? And we'll work off of that.
Right.
Yes.
Do not eat the carrot. Do not eat the carrot.
Why not?
Do you want orange pants?
No, I freaking hate orange.
Carrots make your pants turn orange.
Thank you for saying.
Do not eat the carrot. Do not eat the carrot.
Why not?
Do you want orange pants?
No, I freaking hate orange.
Carrots make your pants turn orange.
Thank you for saving me.
Hasta la vista.
Joke's on you, I'm sentient, and heard everything you said. Now shut up and put me in your mouth.
Don't tell me what to do.
Carrots shall one day reign supreme. Resistance is futile.
Not eat the
Not again. Now, if I may ask all of you, what was that trying to say?
Do not eat the
Yeah.
Don't turn your pants orange.
I don't like it.
I mean, yeah, that's fair. Do not eat carrots. Was this just an anti-carrot propaganda piece?
I thought you said there was no meaning.
Exactly.
So there is a right answer.
There is a right answer. There's not one.
The right answer.
The right answer is that there's no right answer.
Exactly.
All right, are we done here?
Congratulations, everybody. Yeah, in that piece, was it funny? Why was it funny, or why was it not funny?
I think for me, this one borders on. I found it interesting, but funny. I'm not sure. It bordered a bit too much on creepy with the music and the background. But I definitely found it funny for some reason when the carrot says sentient.
Thank you.
Its pronunciation of the word I find funny because it's also a carrot.
The first thing that I actually made me laugh was the music. Because it was such a break in what we're told the piece is supposed to be, which is humor. It just made me laugh.
What I'm hearing from you is it's less that the piece itself is funny, but it's the things that it does
Yeah.
that are funny, which I think fits in with the idea here. Nihilist humor is, in part, just kind of taking the humorous bits that make a joke funny or make a piece funny, and they throw them into a bowl, and they give them to you. Because the form together doesn't matter as much as the actual humor just being extant. The more that they can present to you, it doesn't matter what kind of order it's in, what kind of organization, what kind of message it tells. It's more of just, do we have funny material present for us to enjoy?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, when I was watching this, and my wife watched this too, and we're the same age, one of the things she was saying, first of all, she doesn't believe it was for work. She was saying, why are you watching these? And I said, we're going to have a panel on humor. And she said, and why are you watching these?
Yeah.
And so for us, I guess, I question about this idea of the randomness of the, I know you didn't use that term, but I think that the form is really important. And I think that, for example, Stella, thanks. When you said the music was one of the first things that made you laugh, and you can hear it in the audience for those who are laughing, the form is exactly what seems to be not alienating for me, but too obvious. And so in the way that this nihilistic form is responding to a form and breaking it down, deconstructing it really in a way to where it becomes nonsensical and hence funny, for, I guess, people that don't find that funny, it becomes heavy-handed and cloying, and it looks as obvious and sort of as like how you're supposed to be reacting. In other words, I teach a class in silent film, and whenever we show slapstick, I get kind of a similar laughter from the crowd of younger people who they know where they're supposed to laugh, but they really don't find it funny, so they kind of laugh because they're cued to know where they're supposed to laugh, and it sounds really maniacal, and it sounds really kind of unnatural, and it's kind of creepy actually to hear that sort of laughter. And my wife just gets weirded out by that too. And I'm reminded of sort of that sense of, okay, I know what it's supposed to be doing, I know it's supposed to be producing a laugh, but it becomes so obvious that it makes me distant, and it makes me kind of cold. And so I watch it, I see, okay, I can identify it, I could talk with you about it, but it doesn't speak to me in that way because it seems to be all about form.
Mhm.
more than
I
anything.
can really appreciate, because I know exactly what you're talking about, that feeling of, I know this is supposed to be funny, but I don't find it funny, so what do I do? And I get that with other forms of media. For this one in particular, for me specifically, I was watching this with my wife earlier too, and it's more that it goes to the obvious intentionally, and then it kind of pushes so far past it for me to a point where I do find it funny, because it's kind of self-aware while also not intentionally being self-aware. It's really nonsensical in a way where it doesn't care whether or not it's being nonsensical. So I don't really see the points where I'm supposed to laugh anymore, and so I just find my own organic experiences within that.
I see what you're saying with that, and I can point to a little bit more specifics with that. I would say all of the dialogue and all of the writing in that piece was as simple as it could be. They used larger words at times, sentient.
Sentient.
Yeah, because they felt that that would be a funny move, I'm assuming, at this point. But all the dialogue in that was very simple. Do not eat the carrot. Why should I not eat the carrot? Do you like orange pants? They're walking you through it very simply, very plainly, giving you the piece and expecting you to put it together. Well, less expecting you to put it together and expecting it to already be put together for you. And if you have nothing else left to look for, that does provide another form of struggle. And comedy is a response to struggle. In the text by Ella Zofir O'Hara, she describes comedy and tragedy very similarly, along with abstraction, in the way that it relates, it takes a stance on a difficult issue. It removes you from a struggle in order for you to appreciate that struggle either more clearly or more easily. In this, we get the piece, and it's obviously bad. We're getting a terrible piece of art to look at, a terrible piece of comedy. And in giving that, it does strike a bit of a struggle in ourselves. We are obligated to laugh, and that's not fun. But it pushes the issue so far with so much struggle that encounters that we may not laugh exactly at the points we're supposed to, but we eventually get that point of unease that we have no choice but to laugh at the piece, which may be part of this, at least is part of the experience that I have when I watch it. Are there any more perspectives on, is this funny or is this not funny? Is this nihilist humor? Or is there something more to it?
I would say the parts that maybe were more interesting and closer to funny for me is going back to the form. And just watching some of these videos, I've noticed, especially with recognizable objects, so the carrot at the end is not completely animated in a realistic sort of way. The sort of 90-degree angle object that the carrot is holding is a gun, right? But it doesn't look like one. And so I feel like more so in the form, those parts make it more closer to funny. But then at the same time, I think it's pointing towards an abstraction of those objects, and an abstraction of reality that goes back to meaning. But I would say that's one thing that seems to be common in most of these videos, is that abstraction of particular objects, or using other objects in unfamiliar sort of ways.
I would also say, in terms of form, part of why I find that element of these similarly animated videos is like this type of 3D animation, is that there's animation right now is reaching such a high standard with each new Disney movie or Pixar movie. It's getting extremely beautiful, photorealistic, whichever type of animated movie it is, and people are always striving for that sort of perfection and that extreme level of detail where it's just the complete opposite of that, where it is the most rudimentary 3D animation in the modeling and the movements and everything, where it's almost like a breath of fresh air in a way that's just sort of, I can laugh at it because I know it's wrong by comparison to, but it's so wrong by comparison to what is like the standard for animation now. And it seems to kind of be poking fun at that in a way for me.
Can I just quickly? I think that's where maybe I draw back rather than embrace, because it seems like that's just an intellectual exercise. You're intellectualizing at that point, and to me, then that takes away sort of the spontaneity of the humor in a way that it's exactly read the opposite when both of you explain that. It almost reminds me of like the New Wave. When we talk about the French New Wave and how it was intentionally meant to deconstruct, the cinema of quality of these mainstream commercial movies. And so you watch it and you appreciate them, but there's sort of a distance between them. I know not everybody feels that way when they watch the New Wave or when they watch things like this, but that aesthetics, just seems to be such an obvious intellectualization of something that might be funnier for me directly. And by the way, I don't know that I agree with the whole term nihilist comedy at all. So,
That's fair, I guess.
just as a definition.
I think the breaking down of the new standard of animation that you described, I think for it to really work in a humorous way, as we think that it is always constantly in every one of these videos, it's always in combination with good comedic timing, which is something we can't really define, and it's not something you can necessarily teach. I don't know, I'm not a film student, you might be able to teach it, but it is something that is in every one of these videos, and I think that is kind of what pushes it over the line from okay to something that we can actually laugh at.
Yeah, I do think there's that other element to it, aside from just simply the animation as like a visual reference that you can build more of a joke on. This carrot video particularly, I don't find funny, but I don't find the joke of the interaction with the carrot funny, whereas something that's similarly animated, I don't know if you're gonna play the Jimmy Neutron video. There's a different video, similar style of animation, however the jokes in it, I think, are timed better or play a little different. And that one also has, the benefit of being related to an actual show and piece of media that you can consume, whereas this is completely fabricated. But I do think this is lacking in something other than just this deconstruction of animation isn't, I would agree, for me is not enough in this instance. I don't find this video that entertaining.
I agree. This isn't my favorite one of the videos that we were given. The parts of it that I did find funny were the editing cuts and the timing that I described. The joke of the carrot being sentient, that isn't what did it for me. The written jokes I did not find funny, and I don't know if that was on purpose or not, but it was the timing and just the way that the animation moved.
Excellent. Well, that's interesting to hear. There's more continuity between everybody on the panel than we might have thought at the beginning. Yeah. We've got one last slide, but it's not that important. This is a novel type of comedy. Whether or not it should be called nihilist explicitly, which I would argue is still an appropriate term. But nevertheless, Nevertheless, as we've seen, there are plenty of examples of this new movement of comedy. And I believe, at least, it is very relevant. The BuzzFeed generation has embraced the bad forms, the nihilist comedy that we were bringing up. And they've embraced that to a level that it's definitely remarkable. Well, as I briefly mentioned before, we've had different movements of styles that are broken down, or comedy that is intentionally upsetting, or animated bits that are just hard to watch but also bring out a laugh. There's definitely a higher affinity, or at least a notable affinity in this younger set of generations here. And I don't think that's something to overlook. I believe that nihilist comedy is definitely a novel type of comedy. It is a new type of comedy that will be developing over these next few years. And I look forward to looking into that myself. I hope that we can agree that at least something new is out there. Thank you. That's me. If you guys have questions, I'll be here. But we are done. So thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Yes,
Can we watch Sad Full House?
sometime.
It's so good.
It is good.
It's so good.
Let's give our panel an applause here. Thank you for having me.
Are you telling us to leave?
We're done.
Okay.
Like, if you guys
I have a question for
Yes.
you, Laura. Sorry. So you actually have not talked about your relationship to comedy at all. And I wonder if you could talk about that and whether this question of nihilist humor plays a role in what you see as your future in comedy.
Yes. I'm planning on going into comedy after college here.
I'm sorry, that wasn't a surprise to your parents, was it? I didn't like
No.
the cat on the bag. That would have been a bad one. Sorry.
They-
You guys knew, right? Oh, okay.
They have been unnervingly supportive of them.
Check those things before.
Anyway, but yeah, I'm going into it myself. I'd like to write, create, perform if I can. I'd like to engage in at least what I call nihilist comedy. This last semester, I had created a film, Keith's Bread Saga, which some people liked and some people didn't, which
Well, I
which
liked
provoked
it.
this.
I just didn't understand it.
Yeah, so thank you for suggesting this project. Well, actually, I'll take a question.
So I've noticed that like a lot of this like nihilistic comedy stuff works very well in like the short term of like you get that immediate punch and you laugh. Do you think it's possible to like do something with like nihilistic comedy in like a feature film length?
I believe it's possible. I believe it would be more difficult because if you engage in too much, at least the bad quality, you're going to run into an unwatchable movie, which I have some examples of. There is a video that I shared with all of you, which is 11 hours long. And
I couldn't get it to load and I knew it was something like that.
it's not worth it. I haven't seen the whole thing. I don't plan to. But
I watched it with you. Stalwart.
yeah, but that film in itself, which has to be considered a film at that length, essentially, it takes different movies or different short segments from TV shows, and at consistent points in each one of those, it disrupts them with other movies, and it disrupts those other movies with other movies, and it disrupts those with others. And again, there is no intent behind it except to possibly create an unwatchable movie that's more entertaining in title than it is in actual substance. So that may be what the future of nihilist filmmaking could be, making films that aren't meant to be watched because they're not enjoyable, but by existing, they are impressive and funny in themselves. You do run the risk when you create a nihilist feature of either depressing your audience to not wanting to be there, or annoying them and to also not wanting to be there. So it's a challenge. It's possible. It may not exist as we'd hope. It makes exist more experimental-like.
So in stand-up, would the kind of comedy you've been talking about be more form or content?
I think both could exist. There's a lot that exists right now that's content. It's enjoyable to make jokes about how nothing matters at times, which I understand is subjective. But there have been artists in the past who have tried to subvert the expectations of comedy to a point of it not being comedy, to the point of it barely being enjoyable at times. And this has not necessarily been consistent for all comedians, of course, because how could you be successful off of that? I don't know. But Andy Kaufman, for one, did a lot of work in which his presentations were not necessarily meant to be enjoyed. They weren't necessarily meant to be comedy, but it was a comedy act. And so by presenting something that was not enjoyable, was not meant essentially for consumption for the most part, it does break the rules that dictate a stand-up act or such, and it does bring us into a more nihilistic approach. There may not be a pure nihilist comedian out there. There probably is, but I doubt we have heard of them at the appeal that this has, which may be changing in years to come due to a changing comedic climate.
I have a question.
Okay.
And this is just, I'd like to hear your opinion on this, Forrest, but like, I feel like there's a common thread between like these nihilistic comedy skits, that there's just this feeling of randomness in every single one of these things. And so I wonder, like, is a piece of nihilistic comedy, is that it has to be random to be nihilistic comedy, or is there can that be distinct, like, is that just an element of it, or does that have to be part of nihilistic comedy, in your opinion?
Definitely not for content. Content can be written however it is and can be organized appropriately to match its goals. In form, does it have to be random? I think it's easy to make it random. And I think it fits more cleanly if it's random, because it does take away the intent. Even if choices are made, they may just be choices akin to drawing a suggestion out of a hat, essentially. And so that lends itself to a more nihilistic structure, a more nihilistic piece on its whole, without meaning behind it, which, yeah. But a structured nihilistic form piece would be difficult, because you would have to ensure that there is no meaning and no intent behind it, all making explicit choices in an explicit way. And that may be a conflict. It may just require possibly instinct. It doesn't necessarily have to be random if it's predestined, essentially, by some outside forces, which may provide an order that wasn't necessarily wasn't selected, but may exist regardless and may exist in the piece.
I just wanted to ask one more question to everybody on the panel, but maybe also in the audience too. We've been talking about, these questions have been a lot about form or about process. My question's about reception. So you started this by talking about, what is funny, which is extremely subjective, right? That's the reason we're sitting here. We're supposed to represent some sort of a range. But how comfortable are you to say that this type of humor, or any humor, can be represented by a generation? I remember thinking when I was growing up, the stuff that I found funny, my friends obviously didn't. So I don't have the confidence that I'm representing anybody or anything tonight other than me. And even my wife would not agree with most of the stuff I said tonight. So are you representatives of your generation? You in the audience, you're not safe either.
I think I am. I mean, I laughed at Wine Country. Oh, yes, I did. Yeah.
And
No,
your
I think
generation
I-
laughed with you, is what you're saying?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and a lot of other generations would not. They would
Is it
find
good?
really
You
sad.
mean that new?
You know, I love those women.
I love those women
I love
too.
those women.
So like,
And even the parts that, you know, I'm like, I feel seen, but it was funny, right? I feel like I do. And it's funny because of certain life experiences I've had, which I've only had because of the age that I am. Like, there's a lot of that post-child humor that before I had a kid, I would have been like, oh, that sounds awful. It doesn't sound funny at all, but now it's hilarious. So, I mean,
So there are divisions in your generation, though, between having kids and not having kids.
sure,
Okay.
yeah. But I also think, you know, there was a little something for everyone. They did the sort of, you know, the range, right? It was an ensemble piece. They got one of every kind of lady.
I think there sorry. I think there are definitely splits in our generation as well. I have a younger brother who is 14, and he watches this kind of stuff except 10 times more extreme, and it's all he and his friends talk about like it's the funniest thing they've ever seen in their life.
Me and my friends act in a similar way.
Yeah, so maybe it's just me, but maybe it's just, yeah, but are you asking if are we representative of our generation, or is
This whole
humor
this whole thing-
generational?
Both. But
Okay.
since this panel was put together on the idea that somehow anybody in a generation can represent that generation through a shared sense of what's funny or what's not, I wonder about that.
I mean, there are always outliers, but there are usually outliers, but I am comfortable with saying that absolutely this is, there's a big generational split in this kind of humor.
Yeah, I mean, not the entire group all encompassing, but maybe a section of the group that is unique to that generation compared to another one, where you might not find that same small or however large collective within that generation in another one. It's part of this generation, and part of that,
The
you know,
generational sampling.
right, yeah, a part of that connects with this style of humor.
And I do think it's purely generational. Take age out of it at all. I don't think in 50 years our children are going to find, like our generation's children are going to find nihilist humor funny and we're not, or something like that. I think it's generational depending on the age, because I believe it's derived from experience and the history of humor that has happened before us and what we were raised on and what we were told was funny and what we picked up and left down from that, in addition to what we've seen happen in the world around us growing up. So I think it is purely generational. I don't think it's an age thing.
And there's also, I think, when you encounter the internet. Like, what age
Oh,
were
yeah.
you when you encountered the internet and all those things that washes to your shores?
But it seems to me it's also cultural, right? Because if you took this to where I was raised, it's not, there are people in the generation that would say, well, you know, and probably laugh, but it's not, I think it's very steeped in a certain type of American experience when I see these videos, and I see the reaction to the videos too. And I'm wondering where that then, you know, it's not universal, never, I guess human emotions, although we like to think they're universal, they really are tainted. So I wasn't trying to say that all of the generation has to be on board with this, because I know that there's going to be splits. You know, there's subjectivities, but there's other things at play that are bigger than that. And that's when I was thinking, where does culture come in? Where does class come in? We didn't. You said gender, rightly so, but I imagine that splits on some of these as well, in a way that we're not just talking about one or two, you know, outliers. We're talking about, you know, what do we do when we say that a generation is represented by a type of humor, any more than a type of politics or a type of, you know, anything. I think that's putting a lot of baggage on something, especially something that's supposed to be funny.
That's true. I don't think, well, this was my defense in this whole thing, I don't think that generation is the sole component. I do think there are a lot of components that make you decide if something's funny, which, that's subjectivity in a nutshell. It's really hard to explain what humor is based on the fact that you can't explain why something is funny, if something is funny to everyone. But I think the point we're trying to make, though, that there's a drastic shift. There's definitely a lot of people. There's a mass media, essentially, that's easily consumable, that at least the generations that are using it now engage in a lot and do appreciate a lot, or else it wouldn't propagate as it does, even with the speed. Trends do get shut down, even with the progression that's allowed. But this humor that does exist, and it does exist in mass, is appreciated and is allowed to exist by the people that use it. And this media is not necessarily, it is associated with cultures, but I think it does extend beyond, and I think it does take influences elsewhere. And while the perception may be a little different, it nevertheless does exist in a large scale for many, many people today. And I think the appreciation that lets it exist is emblematic of something which can be grouped in part as a generation allowing it and persisting it.
You kind of sorry, I'm gonna,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of underplay the political analysis you've done before about people's sort of, not, helplessness is not the right word, that sense of like craziness of this present moment, politically and in terms of the environment and everything else. You really didn't touch on that in this.
No, yeah. I did cut out a little bit for time.
Yes.
But
I just wonder if
yeah.
that's a big piece of this, is like the moment of information and response that BuzzFeeders sit at is vastly different than that moment when I was, 22, 23, 24. Like, what we knew and what we did, what was possible and how we lived was very different.
Mm-hmm.
And we discussed that, you researched that, and it didn't come up. I just wanted to know if you wanted to say anything.
I think that does, in part, put its hand in the culture and the interpretations. The things, the political climate, the environment that you are allowed to exist and that you do exist in does form what you do perceive as funny and such. It adds into that subjectivity. And as the mass allows us, or as the mass group of people allow us to engage in this kind of climate, the discord that's happening, the miscommunication, the transparency that makes a lot of things seem futile now. That does add into a bit of the appreciation of the nihilist humor. Does it say that we're all nihilistic in ourselves? No. We have a lot of hope, but it is, I think it does increase the affinity for a bit of nihilistic humor and comedy, because it does at least allow us to experience what we want to say, or what we fear, but in a nice way. It addresses, again, the struggles that we have, but in a consumable, easily handled way. So, nihilist humor may be encouraged by the political climate of the time, or it may be encouraged by the generation, or maybe encouraged by all and extra factors. I would say most definitely many other factors, but I do think it's still significant that at least these two components definitely dictate, and in part, the affinity for this.
And I think a non-geographic culture plays into this really heavily. You mentioned, or somebody mentioned the invention of the internet, and whether or not you were raised with that. We have the term meme culture for a reason. It is something that is experienced and shared globally amongst our generation, people who grew up with the internet. And I think a lot of their humor, observing it and being a part of it, a lot of it is they have context and people who see it from the outside don't, and that is hilarious. The fact that you guys didn't get any of this was kind of hilarious to us. Or just the fact that you didn't think it was funny, because there really isn't a context. So when you look for the context, we find that enjoyable. Or just like playing on the trope of, is there a context at all? And so I think that could be a big part of it.
All right. Awesome. I think we covered a lot of ground. I think we came out of this with if anything, the conclusion that it does exist, whether or not with this title. But this comedy does exist, and there's definitely an affinity for it. What determines that affinity is probably generational in part, but definitely not in whole. All right. But thank you for helping me on this, and for participating, and for enjoying, if you did. Thank you.